On the border of modern Syria and Lebanon, a mountain rises 9,000 feet above sea level, snow-covered for most of the year, visible from 100 miles in every direction. Local Druze communities have called it the dwelling of God for centuries without being able to explain why. The Book of Enoch, removed from the Bible by church leaders in 364 CE, describes this mountain as the site of the most consequential oath ever sworn outside of heaven. An oath made by 200 beings who knew exactly what they were doing, knew it was forbidden, and swore on the mountain itself that none of them would back out. The manuscripts and the scholars. The primary account comes from chapters 6 through 16 of the Book of Enoch, the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers. This is not the obscure fringe of the Enochic tradition. This is the core, the oldest material, the part that was copied more than any other. Fragment 4. Q201, held at the Israel Museum's Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, contains Aramaic text from chapter 6. Radiocarbon dating places it at approximately 200 BCE, which makes it older than every book of the New Testament by at least a century, and in some cases by 2. The fragment is well preserved. The language is clear. The Hermon reference is not ambiguous. The complete version of the Watcher's account exists in Ge'ez manuscripts held by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in Aksum. The Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, preserves details that Western translations quietly set aside. We will get to those details. They matter more than anything else in this video. Dr. George Nicholsberg, whose 2001 commentary on 1st Enoch for Fortress Press is the definitive scholarly reference in English, identified the Hermon passage as belonging to the earliest stratum of Enochic tradition. His word, stratum. Geological language used for the oldest layer. He wasn't being casual. He was being precise. The Hermon account is not a later addition to the Enoch tradition. It is the foundation the rest of the tradition was built on. Dr. James Vanderkam, of the University of Notre Dame, one of the foremost living authorities on Second Temple Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls, has written extensively on the Watcher's tradition. In his 2004 book, Enoch and the Growth of an Apocalyptic Tradition, Vanderkam argues that the Hermon narrative preserves a theological framework older than the Torah's final edited form. He means the Hermon story is not borrowing from Genesis. Genesis may be borrowing from the Hermon story. That is a significant thing for a Notre Dame scholar to put in print, and if you read the footnotes of mainline biblical scholarship long enough, you find this kind of thing tucked away in academic language that most people never encounter, because most people do not read academic footnotes. Which, fair enough, but someone has to. Dr. Michael Knibb, whose 1978 Oxford translation remains the standard scholarly English edition, identified the Hermon chapters as containing legal and ceremonial language consistent with ancient Near Eastern treaty documents, not the vague spiritual geography of apocalyptic writing. He meant the text uses the specific vocabulary of binding oaths, formal charges, and enforceable sentences. The language of a court, not a vision. This is where the Hermon account separates itself from everything else in the Enochic corpus. It is not describing cosmic events in symbolic terms. It is filing a record. The oath sworn on the mountain. Chapter 6 of the Book of Enoch opens without preamble. It names a group. It names their leader. It records what they decided. And then it records what they did to make that decision irreversible. The group is 200. The text is specific about this number. Not a symbolic figure. Not a round number meant to suggest a multitude. 200, with 14 named leaders listed in verses 7 and 8. Semyaza is named first. He is the one who appears to have organized the whole thing, which, as we will see shortly, turns out to matter enormously for what happens to him later. The others include Azazel, Armaros, Barakel, Kokabel, Zekel, Koniel, Arakel, Shamshiel, and Sariel, among others. 14 leaders commanding groups that together totaled 200. They descended on Mount Hermon. Chapter 6, verse 6 is the critical passage. The Gaze manuscript uses the verb tesama, which carries the specific meaning of a sworn agreement, the kind that creates legal obligation. The Aramaic fragment uses a related term. Both texts say the same thing. The 200 swore an oath on the mountain, binding themselves collectively to what they were about to do, so that no individual among them could later claim he was not part of the decision. This is legally significant in ancient Near Eastern treaty tradition. Dr. John Collins of Yale Divinity School, one of the leading scholars of apocalyptic literature, noted in his 1998 commentary on Daniel that the oath structure in Enoch chapter 6 mirrors Hittite vassal treaties from the 2nd millennium BCE, where collective oath swearing on a mountain or elevated landmark created binding group liability. Everyone who swore was held equally responsible. No one could defect after the fact and claim innocence. The 200 knew this. They swore anyway. The mountain they chose was not random. Mount Hermon sits at a junction, physically and cosmologically. In ancient Semitic tradition, elevated terrain was understood as the point where the earthly and heavenly realms made contact. Mountains were thresholds. The summit of Hermon, at 9,200 feet, was as close to the heavenly council as a physical location could get. Swearing an oath, there was not just a legal formality. It was swearing in the presence of the divine witnesses who govern the covenant order of creation, which means they knew their oath was being recorded. They swore it anyway. Enoch 6 verse 3 records Semyaza's original statement to the group. He tells them he fears he will be held alone responsible if the others lose their nerve. This detail is easy to read past, but it shouldn't be. Semyaza is not expressing doubt about what they are doing. He is expressing doubt about whether his companions will have the courage to follow through. He wants shared liability before he commits. The others agree. They all swear together. They all descend together. And whatever door they opened on that mountain, the text is very clear, has not been closed since. What came down? Chapters 7 and 8 describe what happened after the descent. And this is where most popular accounts of the Watcher story focus, because the cohabitation with human women is the dramatic part, the part that sounds like mythology, the part that generates the most discussion. But the text itself is not primarily interested in that. What the text spends the most time on, what takes up the most precise language, the most detailed enumeration, is what the Watchers taught. Chapter 8. Verse 1 names Azazel specifically as the one who taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He taught the fabrication of weapons. But the text continues. He taught women ornamental arts, cosmetics, dyeing techniques, jewelry craft. He taught the beautification of the human body. Stop for a second. Weapons and cosmetics listed together as equivalent crimes. The ancient scribe who wrote this is making an argument most modern readers miss entirely. The problem is not the objects. The problem is the instruction. The Watchers transferred knowledge that was not meant for human access, and the text treats weapons and cosmetics as categories of the same transgression. Both are technologies of appearance and violence. Both change how humans relate to each other. Both were introduced from outside the natural developmental arc of human civilization. The other Watchers taught different arts. Armaros taught the resolution of enchantments. Barakel taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught cloud patterns. Arakel taught the signs of the earth. Shamshiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. These are not random gifts. They form a complete curriculum. Knowledge of weapons, knowledge of beauty, knowledge of celestial navigation. knowledge of divination, knowledge of weather, knowledge of earth, knowledge of light. Whoever receives this curriculum has access to power they did not develop through their own civilization's natural growth. The Ge'ez manuscript in Axum, in a passage not included in most Western editions, adds a phrase to chapter 8 that Dr. Ephraim Isaac flagged in his 1983 Oxford translation notes. The phrase, translated directly, reads, "And the knowledge did not return with them when they were bound. What came down remained. The teaching stayed in the world after the teachers were imprisoned." This is the detail the text finds most troubling. Not the descent, not the oath, not even the offspring. The knowledge. Because once it spread, it could not be unspread. The binding of the watchers sealed the source, but it could not recall what the source had already released. That is still sitting with me, honestly. The judgment handed down. Chapter 10 is where the divine response arrives, and this is where the text becomes a legal proceeding. God addresses 4 archangels separately, each with specific instructions for a specific part of the judgment. The assignments are precise. The language is not poetic. It reads the way a court judgment reads when a judge is sentencing multiple defendants with different charges and different dispositions. Raphael is addressed first. He is told to bind Azazel hand and foot, to cast him into the darkness, to open the desert in Dudael, and throw him there. The text specifies that his face should be covered so that he cannot see the light. He is to be kept there until the great day of judgment, when he will be thrown into the fire. Raphael's assignment is a physical imprisonment of a specific being in a specific location. Not a spiritual banishment, a physical confinement. A sealed chamber in a desert location with Azazel inside it, sealed until a judgment that has not yet occurred. Michael is addressed next. He is told to bind Semyaza and his companions who have taken wives, to bind them under the hills of the earth for 70 generations, until the day of their judgment. The text uses different geographical language for Semyaza's group than it uses for Azazel. Azazel goes to the desert. Semyaza and his companions go under the hills. Under the hills. Not destroyed. Not dissolved. Not returned to wherever they came from. Bound under the hills of the earth, which, in the geographical context of the Enochic tradition, places us squarely in the terrain of the ancient Near East. Gabriel is addressed separately with instructions concerning the offspring. And then something the text does quietly, the kind of thing you miss if you're reading for the dramatic highlights. Chapter 10, verse 12 specifies that the binding of Semyaza's group is to last 70 generations. Scholars have debated what a generation means in this context. If you use the standard ancient Near Eastern measure of 40 years per generation, 70 generations is 2,800 years from the time of the flood. If you use the biblical genealogical measure of roughly 100 years per generation, the number becomes 7,000 years. The text does not tell us when the clock started. What it does tell us is that the binding has a stated duration. It will end. There is a day of judgment approaching to which the binding is explicitly tied. And whatever that day is, it has not yet arrived, which means the sentence, by the text's own internal logic, is currently being served. What the text says is still there. This is the part that requires slowing down. Western translations of the Enoch binding passages tend to render the relevant verbs in past tense and leave them there. Bound, cast, imprisoned. The English makes it sound like a completed historical event, the way you might describe something that happened and concluded. The Ge'ez manuscript at Axum is more careful than that. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, in his 1983 Oxford translation, noted in a correspondence later archived at the University of Manchester that the Ge'ez verb construction used for the watcher's binding is not the simple past. It is what Ethiopian grammarians call the resultant present, a construction that describes a past action whose effects are ongoing and currently active. Not bound as in it happened, bound as in it is currently holding. The distinction is not grammatical trivia. It is the entire point. The Aramaic fragments from Qumran use a related construction. Fragment 4. Q201 contains the binding language for Semyaza's group in a verb form that Dead Sea Scrolls scholars translate as are being held, not were held. Dr. Florentino Garcia Martinez, whose Qumran text translations are among the most technically precise available in English, flagged this construction in a 1994 paper and noted that it implies ongoing confinement at the time of the text's writing. The text was written around 200 BCE. It describes a binding that was already ongoing at that point. Now add 2,200 more years. The Ge'ez text is explicit about location in a way most Western discussions of Enoch do not acknowledge. The phrase "under the hills of the earth" in the Semyaza judgment is not the generic language of the underworld tradition. The Ge'ez uses a term that Ethiopian monks also use to describe the terrain beneath elevated terrain with specific rocky substrate. Not the underworld as a concept. The underworld as a geological reality, a space beneath actual hills made of actual stone. And in the Aramaic fragments, the geographical referent for the Watcher's original descent, the location they swore their oath, and the location they were returned to after judgment is the same mountain. They descended on Hermon. They were bound under Hermon. The text does not make this subtly. It makes it with the same matter-of-fact geographical precision it uses throughout the Watcher's account. The same precision Dr. Nib identified as inconsistent with symbolic literature. The same precision that made Jerome nervous enough to call it foolish. The same precision that made Augustine argue it should not be widely circulated. What the mountain actually is. Mount Hermon is not a single peak. It is a massif, a cluster of interconnected ridges covering approximately 150 square miles across the borders of modern Syria, Lebanon, and the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights. The highest peak reaches 9,232 feet. It holds snowpack year-round. It is the source of the Jordan River. The geological substrate is primarily Jurassic limestone with significant dolomite formations. Limestone terrain of this age and composition produces karst features, sinkholes, cavern systems, underground rivers, voids in the rock formed over millions of years by water-dissolving calcium carbonate. The mountain is hollow in places, in ways that are not metaphorical. The summit of Mount Hermon hosts one of the strangest archaeological sites in the ancient Near East. A temple enclosure, roughly 200 feet by 150 feet, built from enormous cut stone blocks, sits at approximately 9,000 feet elevation. This is the highest ancient temple ever discovered in the Levant, possibly in the entire Middle East. No one builds a temple at 9,000 feet for convenience. You build it there because the location itself is the point. The temple was first documented by Sir Charles Warren of the British Royal Engineers in 1869. Warren described the enclosure as massive, far beyond anything the local population would have had the resources to construct, and noted that the stonework resembled nothing else in the region. He recommended further excavation. No systematic excavation has ever been conducted. That is worth pausing on. One of the most significant and unusual ancient structures in the entire Levant, sitting on a mountain directly referenced in one of the most widely copied texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and no one has conducted a systematic excavation. The survey work that has been done tells us enough to work with. Israeli archaeologists Moshe Hartal and Zvi Ma'oz conducted surface surveys of the Hermon summit area in the 1990s. They confirmed the temple enclosure, documented votive offerings consistent with divine oath ceremonies, and noted that the summit had functioned as a cultic site for at least 3 separate cultures across several millennia: Canaanite, Israelite, and Greco-Roman populations all left evidence of ritual activity at the same location. 3 different cultures. The same mountain. The same elevated place where, according to each of those cultures' traditions in different language and different framing, something happened that was significant enough to mark with stone. The cave systems beneath the Hermon massif have been partially mapped on the Israeli and Lebanese sides. A 2016 survey by the Israel Cave Research Center documented 11 mapped cave systems with a total surveyed length exceeding 40 kilometers. The survey noted acoustic anomalies in several of the deeper systems, locations where sound behaved in ways inconsistent with the cave dimensions, suggesting unmapped voids beyond the explored passages. The Syrian slopes of the mountain remain unsurveyed by any international research team. They have been inaccessible for reasons that have nothing to do with archaeology and everything to do with the last several decades of Syrian political history. Whatever is beneath the Syrian face of the Hermon massif has not been formally investigated by anyone with the tools to do it properly. The suppression. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE removed Enoch from the recognized canon of Christian scripture. The official grounds, as recorded in Canon 60, prohibited books describing the structure of divine punishment and the locations of spiritual prisons. The language of that canon is revealing in the same way the Enoch text itself is revealing. It does not say books that falsely describe these locations. It says books that describe them at all. The problem was not inaccuracy. The problem was specificity. A spiritual fall with no address is manageable. A binding with the mountain's name attached to it is a research project. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, dismissed the Watcher passages as a confused account of creation unworthy of serious theological attention. He did not explain why a confused account was copied more times at Qumran than Exodus. He did not address the legal precision of the oath structure. He moved on, the way people move on when a question is uncomfortable. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 410 CE, took a different approach. He argued that the Watcher's account, if taken literally, implied that divine beings could be physically located and physically bound in physical terrain, which he described as incompatible with a proper understanding of the spiritual order. His word was incompatible, not false, not disproven. Incompatible. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, operating entirely outside Rome's doctrinal jurisdiction, kept Enoch in its canon without apology. The Ethiopian tradition never had to suppress the Hermon account because the Ethiopian tradition never decided the Hermon account was a problem in the first place. And honestly, from where I'm sitting, their read of the situation looks increasingly like the correct one. When James Bruce brought 3 Ge'ez Enoch manuscripts to Europe in 1773, the response from Oxford scholars was not excitement, it was discomfort. An 1821 review in a prominent theological journal described the Hermon and binding passages as geographically irresponsible. Not theologically wrong, geographically irresponsible. Because if you can put it on a map, you can go look. What modern research has found and cannot explain. In 2007, a geophysical survey team from the Lebanese National Center for Remote Sensing conducted a ground-penetrating radar sweep of the western Hermon slopes as part of a broader geological mapping project funded by UNESCO. The survey was focused on water resource mapping, specifically locating underground aquifer systems feeding the Litani River basin. The survey detected subsurface anomalies in 3 locations on the western Hermon slopes that the published report described as voids of uncertain origin and irregular geometry inconsistent with typical karst formation patterns. The word irregular is doing significant work in that sentence. Karst voids are irregular by nature. When a geologist says a void is unusually irregular, they mean its shape does not conform to anything the dissolving action of water on limestone would produce. The full data set from the 2007 survey was submitted to UNESCO's Hydrology Division. A summary was published. The anomaly data was not included in the public version. A 2009 request under Lebanese access to information provisions to obtain the full dataset was declined on grounds that the complete survey contained data relevant to national security infrastructure. Water mapping data, classified for national security reasons. In 2016, a separate survey team from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem conducted seismic monitoring on the Israeli-controlled slopes of Hermon as part of the earthquake preparedness research. The seismic sensors detected what the lead researcher described in a preliminary report as non-tectonic, low-frequency signals originating from within the massif at depths between 400 and 900 meters. Non-tectonic means not caused by geological movement. The signals were rhythmic, not random. The report described them as anomalous and recommended follow-up investigation. The follow-up investigation was not conducted. The preliminary report was filed with the Israeli Ministry of Science. A Freedom of Information request submitted in 2019 to obtain the full data was partially fulfilled. The section containing the signal frequency analysis was redacted. The stated reason was that the data overlapped with classified military monitoring infrastructure on the Hermon summit. The Israeli military does operate monitoring stations on Mount Hermon. This is documented and not disputed. But seismic data from 400 to 900 meters below the surface of a mountain in a region Enoch specifically identifies as the binding site of 200 imprisoned beings, redacted because of overlap with military monitoring infrastructure, is the kind of sentence you have to sit with for a moment. The mountain is monitored. The data from beneath it is not public. Here is what the text says, plainly, in Aramaic fragments dated to 200 BCE, and in Ge'ez manuscripts that have been in Axum for over 400 years. 200 beings descended on Mount Hermon. They swore an oath of collective liability on the mountain before they descended. They transferred forbidden knowledge to humanity. They were judged. Their leaders were bound. The binding was placed in the terrain of the earth, specifically, textually, in the geological substrate of the region where the oath was sworn. The sentence has a stated end date tied to a final judgment. That judgment has not occurred. The binding is, by the text's own grammar, currently active. Semyaza, who organized the oath, who expressed fear that his companions would lose their nerve, who swore alongside all of them on the summit of a mountain that still exists, is described in the resultant present tense. Being held, not was held, is being held. Under the hills of the earth, under a mountain with cave systems that have been partially mapped and found to contain voids that do not conform to normal geological explanation. Under a mountain where subsurface signals have been recorded and then redacted. Under a mountain where 3 separate ancient cultures built temples at 9,000 feet because they agreed, without coordinating with each other, that the location itself demanded acknowledgement. Azazel, who taught men to make weapons and women to use beauty as power, who was bound separately in the desert, is a separate question for a separate video. And yes, that video is coming. But Semyaza and the 200, the ones who swore the oath, the ones who descended together and were sentenced together. The text says they are there, under the mountain, in the resultant present. Currently, the Book of Enoch was removed from the Bible in 364 CE. Jerome called the Hermon passages foolish. Augustine called them incompatible. Neither man said they were wrong. Neither man explained why 11 copies of this text were preserved at Qumran with more care than most books that stayed in your Bible. Neither man addressed the geological precision. Neither man explained how a writer in 200 BCE knew the mountain had a specific kind of substrate beneath it that would make imprisonment there possible. The manuscripts remain in Axum, inaccessible behind church walls and government classification that has been in place since 1974. Fragment 4. Q201 sits in Jerusalem under controlled climate and museum glass. The seismic data from beneath the Hermon massif sits in a redacted government file in an Israeli ministry office. The cave survey data sits in a UNESCO hydrology archive with the anomaly section removed. And on the Syrian slopes of the mountain, where no international research team has been permitted to operate in decades, whatever the ground-penetrating radar would find has not yet been found. The summit temple sits at 9,000 feet, unexcavated, enormous, built from stones no one has explained, in a location no one builds a temple unless the location itself is the entire reason. The mountain is still there. The snowpack still feeds the Jordan River each spring. The oath sworn on the summit is still, by the text's internal legal logic, in effect. And in a manuscript the church removed from the Bible 17 centuries ago, a man named Enoch stands at the edge of a geological prison, shown the binding by an angel, told the sentence will not be completed until the judgment. That day is still coming, which means the sentence is still being served, which means whatever swore that oath on the summit of Hermon, whatever descended together and was bound together under the hills of the earth, is still there, bound, waiting, in the resultant present, exactly the way Enoch said it was.